Another carbon tax video? I'm excited to say yes, because explaining the subtle aspects of this unjustifiably hated climate change tool will help us all to better understand what's true and what's misinformation. But this video will be a bit different because it's mainly going to be an encouragement for you to watch a different video from someone else that explains it way better than I can. The other video is from CBC's Andrew Chang, published at the end of March 2024. But first, I should provide some trigger warnings. Not everyone is open to hearing about what appears to be a well thought out, backed by evidence explanation that largely counter the messages that opponents of carbon pricing throw around. Of course, we all bring our biases to contentious issues like carbon pricing, but if you are at all interested in getting past the "Axe the Tax" slogan and seeing if there's any substance behind the rage, then you should keep watching this video and, more importantly, the CBC one. Another trigger warning. The CBC video is produced by CBC, so right off the bat, if you think it's garbage because you feel the CBC just recites Liberal government talking points, then you may not be ready to hear its discussion about what the experts have said about the carbon tax. In the end, if you do go ahead and watch, you may still hate carbon pricing. It's hard for many of us to be convinced to change our minds. I'm the same way. I'm a strong believer in the value of carbon pricing, and I care deeply about stopping climate change. I read about the other side of the carbon tax argument, and I'm still convinced it's the best behavior change tool we have. Even in the end, if you still think carbon taxes aren't the best idea, at least you'll have seen what the experts are saying, and you'll be in a better position to know what's accurate and what's a gross exaggeration. Axe the rage, kick the elite carbon tax gatekeepers out of the way. Okay, I'm not very good at empty slogans. Let's get going with a brief summary of what the CBC video talks about. First up, there's an explanation of the impact of the carbon pollution pricing program on gas for your vehicle. Over the entire time carbon pricing has been in place, it was started in 2019 by the way, the impact on the price of gas for your car has been a titch over 17 cents per litre. That's total impact of the carbon tax on gas. By comparison, in Alberta on April 1st, 2024, the premier of that province raised the gas tax and the price jumped by 14 cents per litre in one day. So, did the carbon pricing program make gas more expensive? Yep, sure did. Does the price of gas go up and down on a daily basis as a result of all kinds of other mysterious causes that none of us understand? Yep, sure does. So it's not rational to get enraged over the price of gas at the pumps and blame that price increase on the carbon tax, when even without carbon pollution pricing, the price at the pump still swings wildly. The CBC video also talks about the larger impact on diesel fuel, but the same counterpoint exists. Look at this chart of diesel prices over the past 18 years. Lots of fluctuations. And here's a chart of crude oil prices during a similar time period with events that impact the price. It closely resembles the Canadian price of diesel, but with no mention of Canada's carbon pollution pricing, because it's not a significant factor. Next is home heating. The CBC video shows that the carbon pollution pricing program has added $360 per year to the cost of the average Canadian home using methane gas to heat. If you installed a heat pump or are in an area where you have a cleaner source of heat like hydroelectricity, then your heating cost hasn't gone up at all because of the carbon tax. It just applies to pollution-causing fuels. Well, what about farm equipment that burns diesel? Well, farm diesel is exempt from the carbon tax. In fact, around 95% of on-farm emissions are exempt from the carbon pricing program. What about grain drying that uses methane gas? Okay, true, carbon pricing applies to this situation and does in fact raise farmers' costs. They then pass that cost along to others down the line. So it's got to hugely raise the cost of food, right? Nope. It does have an impact on the price of food, but not by very much. Here's what's probably an overly simplistic example. Let's look at one single component of the food cost, transportation of the food. Have a look at this graphic. Using a loaf of bread as an example, a full truck carries 12,636 loaves. If that truck drives 1,000 kilometers, the increased cost for that entire truckload of bread because of the carbon tax would be $53.01. That's increased cost of the diesel fuel. That translates to an increase in the cost of each loaf of bread of less than half a cent. Now, I am no food distribution expert, so it's more complicated than that, I know. Regardless, the cost of that single loaf of bread has risen because of this single element of the carbon tax, but so slightly. There are other components to the cost of food and many other factors impacting the high grocery prices we're experiencing now. But thankfully, the carbon tax hasn't had a significant impact. Next in the CBC video is a brief explanation of the carbon tax rebate. What? There's a rebate? Yes, there is. The opponents of the carbon pricing program rarely mention the rebate, but there is one, and it's designed to help offset the increase in costs as a result of the carbon pricing. The CBC video shows data from the Parliamentary Budget Report to explain that different provinces get different amounts for the rebate, the highest amount being in Alberta. A key message in this part of the video is that if you take whatever steps that are available to you to reduce the amount of polluting fuel you use, then there are fewer costs to offset. And that Canada carbon rebate that you get if you live in one of the 8 provinces using the federal program becomes a net gain for you. The Parliamentary Budget Office report I just mentioned says that as many as 80% of Canadians under this program will get more back in the rebate than they pay in increased costs as a result of the carbon pricing. And I know what you're going to say. There are indirect costs that impact the affordability of things too. The CBC video talks about this as well, by citing another part of that Parliamentary Budget Office report. They use another table of figures that shows when you factor in these indirect things, most Canadians under the federal program are in fact paying more overall. The carbon rebate does not make up for all of the impact of the carbon tax. But to be more specific, it does still cover all of that increase for most of those in society with the lowest incomes. As you move up in your income, you end up paying more. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? If there's a cost to be paid for fighting climate change, and there definitely is, then those who are better able to afford it should pay more. So, does the carbon tax significantly increase costs, all things considered, even the indirect things? Not really, only for those with higher incomes. They can afford it. But it's certainly not pushing people into poverty, as opponents of the carbon tax like to say it does. The CBC video concludes by pointing out that any plan to fight climate change is going to cost money. Fighting climate change isn't free. We need to implement lots of different measures to do our part for the world, and they're going to cost something. We've caused this climate problem and we need to stop it from getting worse. And we can. Carbon pricing is working. An analysis shows that 1/3 of Canada's emission reductions will be as a result of the carbon tax by 2030. Why would you want to cancel a program that's having a relatively minor financial impact on the average Canadian when there's some evidence to show that it could have such a huge positive impact for our climate? Are there some legitimate criticisms of Canada's carbon pricing system? Yes. One is that the federal GST is essentially collected on that portion of the price increase resulting from the carbon tax, so there's an argument to say it's a tax on a tax. Well, that should be looked at to ensure the carbon pricing system is revenue neutral. There's an interesting Fraser Institute report on how the carbon pollution pricing system could be reformed to make it better. The bit in the report's conclusion is particularly interesting from a conservative think tank like the Fraser Institute. Repealing the carbon tax while attempting to achieve the equivalent CO2 emissions reductions will require the implementation of more costly measures such as regulations, subsidies, and tax breaks, which may be less visible than a carbon tax but more economically costly. Such policies would not serve the best interests of Canadians. This point, and some more complicated objections to the federal carbon pricing plan, aren't addressed by the CBC video. They stuck with the things that generate the most misinformation and tried to address those. So, that's your quick summary of the CBC video. You should watch it next. Then really think about it. Take politics out of the debate and decide where you stand on carbon pricing based on factual information, not empty slogans and rage. Canada's carbon tax is good policy that really doesn't cost the average Canadian much. Politicians know this, but are stoking anger because they just want to get elected. They'll say whatever they think will get you angry at the current government, regardless of whether it's actually true or not.